Social policy in regards to providing a safety net for the poor. Before we discuss social welfare policy aimed to protect poor people, let's talk a little bit about income. What it means to be rich and what it means to be poor. Um, the income gap refers to that idea that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is disappearing. We have one of the largest income gaps in the world. 1% of Americans own more than a third of the wealth in this nation. That 1% is actually higher than the total worth of 90% of Americans. So that means 1% of our 300 million people in the United States own 90% of what all the rest of us are worth. Now, it's really easy to say that these people worked really hard for their money and that we shouldn't allow them to have it taken away. But I want you to remember some of these people who are rich didn't work a day in their life. Their parents or their grandparents worked really hard and they do benefit from the hard work of their parents. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but always keep in mind those Paris Hiltons. The average household income in the United States is $46,000. There is no other country in the world with such an extreme distribution of income. And I want you to think about that. $46,000. You know how you think that I'm broke because I'm a teacher and how I don't have any money? But the average household is $46,000. That's what I make in a year, and I'm one person. Together, when you add Mr. Geromin and I's income, we're twice that. We make twice as much as the average household, and you think that we're broke. So there are people who really are struggling in the United States to make ends meet. We have a policy of income redistribution in this country where we take money from people who have more and we take a higher percentage of their money and we pay for services for people who are at the bottom. Progressive taxes explain that. So progressive taxes are the idea that your tax rate and the percentage of taxes that you pay in income tax increases as you make more money. But remember, there's a lot of loopholes around this, and certain types of income or certain types of wealth that aren't directly related from profits or work on a daily basis, like the income that you make off of investments, doesn't get taxed hardly at a high rate as like my income taxes. My investment returns get taxed at a much lower rate than my income. So in that regard, Warren Buffett, because most of his money is tied up in investments, he's one of the richest men in America. He pays a lower tax rate than your parents do. The idea of counter redistribution is the idea of flat taxes. Flat taxes are what, again, you pay on investments and what some tax reformists would like to see us do with all income tax. Counter redistribution would be you pay the same rate regardless of how much you make. So if you made $30,000 a year, you would pay 10%, and if you made $300 million a year, you'd pay 10%. If you're making $300 million a year, 10% is a drop in the bucket to what you're bringing home. If you make $30,000 a year, $3,000 means a lot to you. $3,000 means groceries for the year. $3,000 could mean a brand like not a brand new car, but a used car and the insurance on that car. You need to start thinking of wealth as a little bit different than just money that you make from earning it. It's the value of assets owned, it's your property, it's your stock, it's your cash, it's your art. And then I want you to also think of the people who don't necessarily work really hard for their wealth. Like the Walmart heirs. They're still running Walmart, but they're not the ones that did all of the legwork. They're not the Sam Waltons. They still have to make business decisions, and they still deserve money and a payout if they make good business decisions. But I think in this country we have a true tendency to demonize the poor and uphold the wealthy. And I don't want people to not work to be wealthy and successful, but I also don't want to see people demonize poor people. Poor people aren't always taking advantage of the system. So let's talk about how people view the poor. Um, People view the poor as they didn't work hard enough. People who are avoiding work, or they don't want to get a job. You can get a job if you have to. That kind of idea. But in this country, we have something called the working poor. People who might have 2 to 3 part-time jobs that don't pay a lot, and in those 2 to 3 part-time jobs, they're unable to make ends meet. They might be at a disadvantage because of where they live in the country, that there's not as many job opportunities where they live. They might be at a disadvantage because the work that they are trained to do is no longer available, like manufacturing work. Most of the people that are poor in this country actually live in the rural areas. A lot of the more people in this country that are poor are also um, black and women. We count the poor. To count the poor, the census has established the poverty line, which is a minimum amount of money a family must spend to maintain an austere standard of living. And what I mean by austere, I mean like all you need to keep a shelter over your head, minimal food in your belly, and a way to get to work. It doesn't really even include clothing. Now, clothing doesn't have to be expensive, but I'm just saying that's how austere it is. Food and shelter and transportation. Now, since the poverty line had been calculated, the cost of shelter has increased. Shelter, when the poverty line was first calculated, shelter was only considered to be a fifth of the cost. Now shelter is a third of the cost for most people. So if you made $1,000 a month, you know, you would have to probably spend in order to live. Honestly, if it was just you need a 1-bedroom apartment. You can probably find some 1-bedroom apartments in this area for about $500. That's still over a third of what you. And the point is that shelter has increased, like shelter costs have increased. So the poverty line is actually artificially low. In 2005, poverty line was $15,000 for a family of 3. So family of 3 was supposed to make it on $15,000 a year. So take this, a mom and 2 children are supposed to pay the bills on $15,000 a year. Now, if you fall below the poverty line, then you qualify for means-tested programs. Means-tested programs are those services that you have to meet the standards in order to receive. And the means test is you do not have enough money to make ends meet, so you can get assistance like entitlement programs. Entitlement programs would be things like SNAP benefits, which is food stamps, or free and reduced lunch. Okay, entitlement programs might be considered welfare programs as well, like payments to families, payments to families with kids. Okay. Deserving, somebody who is considered or viewed as deserving of entitlements through means tested programs tend to be single moms who are working two jobs and have a kid. Um, People who are working hard but just aren't making enough money to make ends meet. Of course, the undeserving would be considered the people who are abusing the system and not looking for work. So there's both in our system, unfortunately. And in our system, the media likes to focus on pointing out the undeserving. The feminization of poverty is a term that relates to the fact that an increasing concentration of poverty is among women, especially unmarried women and their children. I would like you to take a minute to look at some of these graphs too. This is a poverty line chart. This shows you the, oh, I can't see it. It's a male-female earnings chart comparison. And this is also a map of the country where most people are, where you see the most levels of poverty. And in the dark blue would be where you have a higher concentration of poverty. Okay. So more means tested programs. In order to get a means tested program, your income has to be low enough to qualify you. Your income must fall below a certain level, which the state government tends to determine. And then once you fall below a certain level, you are eligible for assistance. Again, poverty rates are artificially low. Okay. The first welfare or means tested program that we had in the United States was aid to families with dependent children. In 1935, it was a small program, but as the number of single mothers grew and divorce rates grew, it was too big. Then in the 1980s, you had a crack epidemic in the inner cities, and the media focused on stories about welfare drug mothers and people selling food stamps for crack. Now, there are many ways to abuse the system, but of course, the media, as a gatekeeper, focused on these sensational stories, and aid to family with dependent children got a really bad rap for a very long time. So there was pressure to reform the system. So right now, instead of welfare, we have what was called workfare. You must be employed to receive benefits. It's PRAWA and TAMF. TAMF stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. PRAWA is a work opportunity act that'll help get people on workfare a job. Now, a major push in 1994 under Newt Gingrich's policy agenda, Contract with America, Newt Gingrich sought to eliminate the AFDC. The federal government allowed states to try to think of a way to reform aid to family with dependent children. And they got the idea from a couple of states who were running the workfare programs. Now, the Fed provides block grants to states to provide assistance to families in need. But most states say that you can only collect workfare for 5 years. There are clear work requirements, and you have to have been employed for at least 2 years out of your life in order to start to receive these workfare benefits. We also established the Earned Income Tax Credit. So if you aren't making too much money, you get almost all of your tax money back up to $350,000 or $3,500. So if the federal government took $3,500 from you in your federal income tax and you were below a certain level, you would get your money back. Okay, SNAP, WIC, EBT, school food, all of these are nutrition programs WIC goes to women and who are pregnant, infant, and children. You can buy things, healthier foods that are good for kids and infants and pregnant women. EBT are the debit cards that you now use for food stamps. We use debit cards because it's supposed to reduce the instances of fraud where you're not supposed to be able to sell your EBT card in exchange for cash or drugs. You know, school food is also, there are many programs where all students should get free breakfast and then reduced lunches and whatnot. But SNAP benefits, these nutritional benefits, they're tied to farm subsidies. So SNAP benefits are sometimes cut when or threatened when we can't figure out whether or not we're going to give farmers their payouts to protect their crop money and their crop revenues.